All right, checked versus unchecked exception. What does this mean? Well, generally speaking, checked exceptions fall outside the control of your program. If you're trying to read a file that doesn't exist, you'd get a file not found exception. And this would be a checked exception. It's not caused by any fault in logic of your program. It falls outside the control of your program. And this right side are the checked exceptions. So the example of input-output exception, SQL exception, and then there's what's those other ones I forgot. Parse exception is pretty common. You won't see too many of these. There's like a handful that are the most common. These must be put in a try-catch or must be listed in the throws declaration of the method signature. We'll see that shortly. They're checked by the compiler. That's why they're called checked exceptions. So again, we must handle it for our program to be able to run. The method that contains the line of code that causes the exception can either handle the exception itself or declare it in the method signature, thereby passing off the handling responsibility to the code that calls the method. And any exception that inherits directly from the exception class is automatically treated as a checked exception. If you want to create your own custom exception and make it a checked exception, all you need to do is extend exception. Again, so these classes on the right, these are checked exceptions, and they're inheriting directly from exception. Compare that to unchecked exceptions. These are the ones on the left, and they're a little different. These are exceptions, they reflect some error inside the programming logic. You'll come across these exceptions more often in your code. For example, arithmetic exception, null pointer exception. There's array index out of bounds exception, and a bunch of others. And again, they inherit directly from runtime exception, so that's important. These are not checked by the compiler. It's up to you to handle them if you want to or not. Your program will still run. And they don't have to be listed in the method signature as possibly being thrown. And you don't need it in a try-catch. This makes your code look a little cleaner because it doesn't get filled with try-catch statements, but the downside is that it might crash, and ideally you don't want your program to crash. You'd want it to recover from almost every kind of exception, and that would mean including try-catch statements. But with unchecked exceptions, that isn't mandatory. So let's look at this in code. All right, let's see how quickly I can go through this. This is just a simple class. I called it John, implements musician, which isn't really important. What I want to bring your attention to is this method exception method. This is an example of a checked exception. The file not found exception is a checked exception. And specifically on line 11 is where the problematic code is. And that is the line that will throw the exception. That's why I have to declare it on the method signature that it throws the file not found exception. If I were to take this out, and let's say here, there, then I get this red line here because I'm not declaring in the method signature that this is a method that throws an exception. By the way, how do I even know this file input stream will throw specifically that kind of exception? Well, if you look at the official docs, we can see that when we look up file input stream, that it's declared, it throws a file not found exception, and this will be true of any kind of checked exception. It has to be declared. So let's just put the declaration back at the top, and again, this red line goes away. And now this is kind of like a game of hot potato. We're not handling the exception here. We're just passing it on to someone else, throwing the potato to the next person. And the next person in this case would be the method up the call stack, essentially the method that called this method. I have it here in my main method. It's calling the exception method here, and if we uncomment this out, we'll see that there's a red line here. If you guess the reason is because it throws an exception and we're not handling it, then you would be correct. We could wrap this in a try catch here. And what's wrong with my computer? It would catch the exception here, and then we would do when that line doesn't go away. Eventually that line will go away, and so now that error line goes away because we've caught the exception thrown by calling this method. I don't want to catch it here. Normally, if you don't catch it here, then your program won't even run because it's a checked exception. So you have to deal with it. Let's just comment that out and go back here and look at the same method, except this time we're handling the exception within the method. So exception method with try catch. If we ran this method, exception method with try catch, there's no red line that appears because this method doesn't throw an exception. That's why we don't have this file not found exception declaration in this method, because it's not throwing the exception, it's handling it itself. Specifically, it's being handled within this try catch block here. And this, once we do catch it, this specific code will just print out that the exception was caught, and it'll continue on. I'm catching this specific exception that was thrown instead of the more generic one, which I could just catch exception, but it's generally better practice to be specific when you're catching. So those were checked exceptions. We have to deal with them. Our program won't run otherwise. We'll get those red error lines. Compare that to unchecked exceptions. Just to remind you, unchecked exceptions are faults in our programming logic. So this is a very simple example. We have an array of size 3. We're trying to access the fifth element, and of course that will throw an exception. So if we try to run this as unchecked exception, and let's try to run this code, see what happens, it will crash. And it crashes because there is a array index out of bounds exception that was thrown, and it wasn't handled. So if we go back to our code, let me minimize this. Notice that there's no red lines here. The compiler's not complaining. We could still run our program. It ran, it just crashed, but at least it ran. That wasn't the case with the checked exceptions. So with unchecked exceptions, we could still run our code, and the compiler doesn't complain about any line. And that's the main difference between checked and unchecked exceptions. If we were to catch the exception, this is the same method, except this time I'm catching the exception within the method, then it no longer throws the exception. And I just want to point out here, so I'm catching it here, and then this line gets executed next. And just to demonstrate, so go here and then run this code. We see that we caught the exception, and we reached the end of the method's code. So hopefully, just by looking at this, the chart I showed earlier makes a little bit more sense and explains the differences between checked and unchecked exceptions. Thanks for watching.